I would totally respect. But otherwise, I think from that perspective, I'll just throw out there to kind of kick off the discussion about this particular movie. There is a scene where we get our first glimpse of these container pods in this giant elevator. Willy Wonka meets The Exorcist, and we get a glimpse of all these iconic monsters that populate our genre. And when I saw this film, 2012, in the theaters, one of the initial thoughts that initially popped in my head after, holy cow, was to somehow link every one of those monsters to a mental disorder. And as part of that, The Cabin in the Woods is one of those films that I ask students to watch prior to a particular course, including the one I'm teaching this fall, as a way to introduce our course syllabus. So the low-hanging fruit would be to simply pick one of those monsters and discuss the context in psychiatry. That is, what might it represent when it comes to a mental disorder? So with that idea, I'll ask anyone who wants to unmute or post in the chat. Gabriella will moderate. What is it that you'd like to start off talking about this evening?
I think it was interesting, and it really created such an interesting premise that there were all of these people who, were doing this sort of terrible thing, and they sort of justified it as in the name of like the greater good, but they were able to disconnect so thoroughly from the horror of it. And I guess the implication would be they've done this so many times, they're very desensitized, but even the intern, who was, I guess in theory new, still seemed rather desensitized. So it kind of made me think about like that cognitive dissonance, which I found interesting.
I completely agree. And in watching this movie as an independent participant moviegoer, very quickly, I felt that the curtain had been pulled on what I have been watching since, for me, the early 80s. Actually, I lied, the early 70s. And what it took for all of those creations to make the big screen so that I could enjoy them and that the industry could be as lucrative as it is. So there was a kind of a meta to it all. The other part of this too, just to play devil's advocate, to create that cognitive dissonance, wasn't it for the greater good? I mean, when we provide medical research, we enlist subjects that can actually, albeit with full informed consent, of course, be in a similar situation. Now, these 4 did not consent to what they were exposed to and endured. So clearly, there's a big breach there. But there is some parallel between the greater good and the adverse consequences that some individuals pay for things like cancer chemotherapy agents, et cetera, to be approved. So perhaps a loose parallel, but certainly one that I think we could appreciate in medicine.
I do really like that interpretation, especially after reading, like medical apartheid and seeing like some of the medical research that has been done without the same level of consent, supposedly for the greater good. So it's a good interpretation.
And again, even if we keep focused on our own discipline with regard to our history of psychiatry, there's a lot there that we could look at now in hindsight and recognize that, number one, it was archaic, it was perhaps even brutal, but also in terms of where we are today, perhaps necessary in terms of building from something, even though a few of us might be proud of some of the ice water baths and other quote unquote archaic modalities that were once used as part of our own discipline.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, how those things can be perceived either for the greater good or as really not ethical things at all to do. The movie also made me think of things that are certain, like, quote unquote normal in certain cultures. But from a perspective of a psychiatrist coming from outside, we may look at it and think, wow, this is, for lack of a better word, crazy. What are they doing? And an example I could think from Brazil, and the Brazilian students might be familiar with this. We have a specific religion there that is practiced by some people called candomblé, and they do animal sacrifices. And certainly, if you think of somebody, a psychiatrist from the United States or from another country, looking into that, might think, wow, certainly some antisocial traits here, animal cruelty, what is kind of going on. But it is culturally acceptable, and like we have to think culturally that those things can be practiced and considered quote unquote normal, and so they wouldn't be necessarily pathological. So that was a very interesting thing that the movie made me think about.
It's a great point. No, it's a great point. Again, just a reminder for the US medical students here, if someone presented to you with a chief complaint of blank, and at some part of their history, you understood that there was animal sacrifice, and you rendered a medical opinion that the behavior surrounding the animal sacrifice is directly linked to their chief complaint, upon finding out that within a particular culture, this behavior was sanctioned, there is little to do but reassure your patient that this is, for lack of a better word, normal, right? And that's reflected on every test you will take. Now, that isn't to say that it's okay in the United States to harm animals. It's just saying that if there's animal harm that is occurring, it's not under the rubric of a psychiatrist to intervene. The psychiatrist on their shelf exam, on their board exam, will choose normal behavior. If there's other entities that are going to look into this, so be it, but it shouldn't be a psychiatrist, right? It's culturally sanctioned. I also I just thought about this too. I don't know if it's a little bit of a stretch, but I love the fact that Sigourney Weaver's character is the director, because to the extent that we can parallel what she's been directing with medicine, perhaps even psychiatry in particular, the title that we have for such people is medical director. So we add a little adjective on, but the fact is that a director is a director. So the parallel between what she does and what the field of psychiatry has done in their history, and that parallel is bridged by the actual title of Sigourney Weaver's character in The Cabin in the Woods. And also too, if we're going to look at this, and now I'm looking at this through the scope of psychiatry's history, we have to also appreciate that not only should we look cross-culturally with regard to being sensitive, and therefore looking at what a culture would deem sanctioned, but also for a single culture over time. That's another form of prejudice that we have to make sure that we don't get caught up in, to be teleocentric, to impose our current culture standards on the way, for instance, psychiatry was practiced in our own culture, yet decades ago, if not centuries ago, right? So it's not only between cultures, it could also be within the same culture over time. So even though I made a comment about ice baths, we have to respect that at the time, that's what the evidence appeared to suggest would be helpful, right? And if we look into some details on how some of these things actually came to be acceptable practices, they didn't have any double-blind or placebo-controlled studies, but certainly there were observations made by physicians that stuff worked. That's why it was that current practice.
Good evening, Dr. Tobia. Good evening, Gabriela. My name is Yasmin, and I'm the current Vice President of the Psychiatry Study Group in the Barão de Mauá University here in Brazil. And from the psychiatry point of view, what do the characters in the control of the torture in the film represent?
Which particular characters?
What?
You mentioned that you asked about what the characters represent. What particular characters were you identifying?
The cards that control the torture.
So again, I think there's a metaphor here. Again, I always parallel this with medicine. If Sigourney Weaver's character is the medical director, those gentlemen in those white short sleeves shirts would be middle management, right? And then, of course, the four individuals, albeit without consent, would be the quote unquote study subjects, those who sacrifice for the good of science. So that's the parallel that I would kind of promote with regard to maybe your counterparts in medicine in general, and certainly maybe psychiatry in particular.
Thank you.
The other thing too I want to mention is, and again, we could look at this from the perspective of the ice bath, the gyrating chair, etc. But how long back did this go with regard to this form of human sacrifice? And at that time, it would be very interesting to understand how this came about, how this sacrifice, this actual underground plan actually came to be. Because remember, at the very end of this movie, it's a Greek god or goddess that actually destroys that cabin. And before the credits come up, we understand perhaps destroy the world. So that would have happened, that level of destruction would have happened at or about the time of ancient Greece, if not for someone discovering that human sacrifice would save the world. So even though today, as we're looking at this, we see these four people struggling to salvage their lives, the fact is that this all started because the earth was at an imminent death. And even though I'm not going to justify what the director does, I think we need to look at that in the proper context, understand the consequences of those last two standing, the final girl in horror genre speak, and in this case, the stoner, what it meant that they survived, because in the end, they don't. Like, none of us do.
Yeah, understand. Thank you.
Right? So.
Hi, good night to you all. And I found very interesting the fact they show us of how religion is so present in our society today. Like we all fear the devil, but we always choose the less bad. I don't know how to say that, but we keep making sacrifices to the greater good, but we don't even know if it is real or if it will hurt us sometime. And how we keep choosing the people who can die and the people who can't. Like the girl who is a virgin, she can't die, but the other ones, that's okay. She has the most value, and the other, they don't. Like I think that there are some values that come from centuries ago until now, and we keep choosing who can die and who can't. And I think that from a psychiatrist point of view, that is something to, I don't know how to say that, but to construir. I don't know how to say that in English.
Kind of think about, to disconstrue, to go against.
Actually, I completely agree. My take on that is that I think initially what that sets up is a discussion with regard to human behavior at the individual or interpersonal level, and that at the systems level. The greater good would be the system, and the actual individual sacrifice would be at the interpersonal. So that there's not always a synchrony between the two. Some of the things we do in medicine with regard to a systems approach results in some individuals being, for instance, disenfranchised. And if we were to make things 100% focused on the interpersonal, we wouldn't include some of the things that we did approve or invent with regard to the systems approach. So that the two are not always in sync. And I think that, again, is another parallel in medicine with regard to the point that you brought up. With regard to the interpersonal level, and just to get an example of how these two can merge, at the interpersonal level, you again have to make sure that you're always culturally sensitive. And that's one of the things that the American Psychiatric Association made it a point to really represent or be represented in a lot of the mental disorders or diagnosing of mental disorders in the latest revision of the DSM, the DSM-5. That if the behavior is culturally sanctioned, that it should not be deemed a mental disorder. Well, to your point, if a particular movie disobeyed the rules, if they were non-compliant with the quote unquote systems level mandate, if they departed from what the culture wants, that movie's not going to make enough money. Right? We see this all the time. Well, I happen to pick up on this all the time. There are horror movies that are wonderful for 95% of the film. And in the last 10 minutes, Hollywood caters to having a happy ending, where the movie was so intriguing or provocative, they could have easily went in a different direction and not followed the trope, not followed the systems approach. But they decided to satisfy the system as a whole. And in doing so, they disenfranchised some individuals who realized this isn't realistic, this is a happy ending. It almost feels as if, and I wish I had an example of a movie, and I'm certain over the next hour or so, one will pop in my head, but the ending would have been much more realistic if they deviated from that culturally sanctioned must, right? So it's an example of how in the individual level, one can think one way, but in this case, the Hollywood producer catered to or was more compliant with what we would refer to as a systems approach. That is, we wanted the larger system, call it the audience, fandom, call them whatever you want, because the bottom line is that if you're going to disenfranchise somebody in the movie industry, you better disenfranchise the minority, because if the majority is disenfranchised, that just means that what's happening at the box office is not going to meet your bottom line. And anybody here ever? I have no clue how many people here tonight are true horror film fans, and I think the horror genre certainly would be an example, an easy example of where we can see this happen. Although I'm sure it happens across all genres. Anyone have any movie in mind where you were thinking that the ending would go one way and should go one way, and at the end it looks like the producer just gave up, and maybe even they had an ending but decided to change it, maybe because of the previews? I don't have any off the top of my head either. And the best examples of this, I think, are movies that are adapted from novels, because in the novel, writers don't care that much about appeasing and having happy endings. But happily ever after ending is something that the film must need. So you have people, writers, directors, producers actually changing the endings of novels so as that it's more appetizing to the general public, and it means more at the box office.
I was reading about how they did that with the adaptation of Stephen King's The Mist, and how Stephen King actually really liked how they changed the ending, and he was on board with it. And it was actually, they ended up making it more gruesome. In like his writing, it was sort of left ambiguous as to how things ended. And then they changed it so that the man like killed his family right before they were getting saved. So I thought that was kind of an interesting change that you wouldn't normally see.
Completely agree. I watched the ending of The Mist and was absolutely paralyzed. I was like, I couldn't believe what I just saw. And I honestly, I'd never read Stephen King's novel. Maybe it was a short story. So at that time, I didn't understand that the ending of the movie deviated from the novel, from King's work. But just watching the movie as a standalone, yeah, that ending certainly left me feeling empty, and certainly is the anti-example of Hollywood catering. That one just took your breath away. Dark, like very dark.
I kind of wanted to go back to your point, Dr. Tovia, of like looking at the monsters, because they were such a big part of the movie. They were certainly so interesting to see. One that caught my attention was the werewolf. I don't know if you guys remember, he made his appearance when they were doing like the purge of the facility after all of the monsters were released. I don't know if anybody has like any idea of what the werewolf could represent in psychiatry if we're looking at it metaphorically. If anybody has any ideas.
I'll leave it open to the audience before I render an opinion. I'll mute and have others answer with their ideas.
I could maybe see it as representing like a tendency to sort of split, like seeing things as all negative or all bad, because like the werewolf to me kind of represents like a Jekyll and Hyde situation, because they are, you know, suddenly turned into this very different thing, and their actions don't represent what they would normally do in the day-to-day.
Anyone else? Well, I certainly wouldn't disagree with the splitting metaphor. It's hard to say that you can't find splitting in the werewolf. I mean, you're talking about a creature that literally shapeshifts, albeit you know, at the sign of a full moon. So there's a couple of ideas here with regard to the werewolf. Number one would be the shape-shifting syndrome. Now, that's not the clinical term. The actual diagnosis that medical students will have to find on tests and exams is the Fragoli syndrome. So it's the delusional belief that an individual can take multiple forms. In this case, a man or a woman and a wolf. All right, so I think that would be low-hanging fruit. And is the werewolf mythos really a symbolic, fictional case study of the Fragoli syndrome? Now, the Fragoli is an undifferentiated delusional syndrome. When we think of delusional disorder, we understand that there are several subtypes, including jealous, persecutory, erotomanic, grandiose, and somatic. But some delusions, some delusional content simply does not fit neatly in any of those 5 categories. And in such cases, they go into an undifferentiated grab bag category. There are several undifferentiated types of delusions that were described by different neurologists, etc., that bear the name of the individual who first identified them, and Fragoli syndrome is one of those examples. So it's the delusional belief that an individual can take multiple forms, otherwise referred to as the shape-shifting syndrome. That might be the werewolf. The other part of this would be the fact that a quote-unquote normal person turns into an animal and behaves impulsively. And along those lines, that description seems to be incredibly consistent with intermittent explosive disorder, where an individual at baseline has little to no problems with regard to aspects of impulsivity, but often described as coming out of the blue, they are prone to impulsive behaviors, including aggression both physical and verbal. So the werewolf can be a metaphor, turning into an animal, impulse control disorder called the intermittent explosive disorder, or IED. Now, one of the things about the impulse control disorders in general is that these clinically significant impulsive behaviors cannot occur in the context of a larger mental disorder. So if you are treating a patient who has a pre-existing condition like antisocial personality disorder, like bipolar disorder, like schizophrenia, within which impulsivity often exists, if they have a clinically significant event of impulsivity, it's going to be difficult for a clinician to diagnose a secondary disorder, intermittent explosive disorder. And the only way you would really be able to do that is if you basically showed or revealed that the impulsivity was not in the context of the larger condition. And again, that would be very difficult to do. So that's a consideration here as well. Intermittent explosive disorder, but it still begs the question, is the werewolf diagnosable with another perhaps larger disorder within which impulsivity is a diagnostic criterion? And if you read the original, right, and if you've seen the movie starring Lon Chaney, you know that there are several references made to his having bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder, with the wolf being manic and the man being depressed, manic depression, wolf man, I think might explain the impulsivity. So that's another that would be in the differential diagnosis of the werewolf. Rule out bipolar, rule out intermittent explosive disorder versus the Fragoli syndrome. And of course, we couldn't neglect that maybe the werewolf also splits as part of a personality trait. And the answer is yes. In our PowerPoint slide set on the bipolar and related disorders, we do discuss the origins of the werewolf and the film, The Wolfman. Other topics I want to discuss this evening. Again, the primary topic is The Cabin in the Woods. Anything pertaining to this particular film that caught your eye that you'd like to discuss further?
If you wanted to keep going down sort of that same pathway just for another minute, at first when I saw the little ballerina, I like couldn't quite picture what that was, but then I was thinking about like eating disorders, considering it is a mouth and ballerinas are so tied to sort of like anorexia in our culture. And I was thinking that might be a good explanation.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and I bought the compendium. I actually bought the soft cover book on all those monsters in the movie. And the monster we're referring to is the ballerina, I can't pronounce the word, ballerina dentata, right? So it has several rows, that's ROLES of teeth, ballerina dentata. And yeah, I think we're talking about eating disorders and probably anorexia nervosa specifically. I do. I also like the fact that in Black Swan, which is a movie about a ballerina with anorexia nervosa, there is a scene, the club scene, that if you go frame by frame, gives you a lot of hidden details of different things that perhaps are going through Nina's mind. And one of those hidden frames happens to be a little toy box with a ballerina that, absent the actual rows of teeth, looks similar to that ballerina dentata, right? So I think we start there. I think there is significant psychoanalytic theory about what causes anorexia. And I think in a similar context, looking at the ballerina dentata, Freud actually would have a lot to say about this monster. And it really starts with the Oedipal or the Electra complex, right? When Oedipus discovers that he slept with Jocasta, who is his mother, what does he do next? Anybody here know their Greek mythology? He blinds
Doesn't he?
himself. Sorry, Michael, did you say, I'm sorry, Michael?
Yeah, I was gonna say, doesn't he take the brooch and like kind of put them in his eyes? But you had mentioned blind himself.
He does. He blinds himself. And anthropologists, maybe even psychologists and psychiatrists, interpret that with what? It's a symbolic form of castration, right? With the face linked to the genitals, right? So it's a symbolic form of castration. Again, and that's not coming from me. That's coming from what I was taught when I was in a literature class, right? So it's a symbolic castration, blinding himself. So the face has always been linked to the genitals. So now we have the ballerina dentata with that and those sets of jaws. And if that links to the genitals, there's actually a movie that really brings this to the forefront. Anybody here see the movie Teeth? Right, so the movie Teeth is just about that. It's about someone, and this is an urban legend. This is mythos, born with teeth in her vagina, right? Again, linking what would be the ballerina dentata to that urban myth and to that movie Teeth. So you can't watch Cabin in the Woods back to back as a double feature with the film Teeth and miss what the ballerina dentata truly represents. And all of this is part of a psychoanalytic description and explanation of what anorexia is about, right? So yes, the ballerina does link to anorexia, albeit through a psychoanalytic mechanism. By the way, if you get uncomfortable watching films, don't watch Teeth.
Yeah, I do feel like this is a fun game. I feel like we could talk about all of these different monsters.
Oh,
But it would take up the whole night.
welcome to my life. Again, I have no problem doing this. By the way, I want to say that was it? I think it may have been American Horror Story Coven. I think one of the witches had the same ailment, condition, teeth. So again, it's a universal urban myth.
You also couldn't miss the scene with the Japanese floaty girls, how it resembled The Ring. That was another very interesting part to me. And at the beginning kind of felt disjointed, like why were they showing us the Japanese side? But I think they were just trying to show us that everywhere in the world they were doing sacrifices. It was just not just in America. And each culture has their own kind of like iconic monster, per se, that they were using to terrify these peoples and kill them for the sacrifice. But definitely like the parallel with the Ring was very evident on that scene for me.
So I just put a couple of not so clinical terms in the chat room. So the Japanese floaty girl, it goes by the name of Utbird or Myling, right? So they're two separate terms for the same description of the Japanese floaty girl. I don't know if in Japan they would think that Joss Whedon's Japanese floaty girl is necessarily politically correct. Myling is the probably more correct term, more accurate term. So the next question is, well, what is a Myling? And does it have anything to do with the Cabin in the Woods or even The Ring, right? When you look at aspects of the undead, the breakdown is the corporeal undead versus the uncorporeal. And while the uncorporeal undead are mainly ghosts and spirits, the list of the the list of the corporeal undead, I think, are much more significant in terms of numbers, like vampires, etc. We all know of zombies. But when we go down that list, and you can access any website to see this, when you go down that list, you come across this ghoul called the Myling. And what the Myling is thought to be is the embodiment and soul of, it's usually a little girl, it's focused in Asia, who has died of unnatural consequence and who has not been properly buried. And what they do is haunt until provided a proper burial. And when you look at the ring and you realize what the Morgans did to their daughter and how she is in that well instead of a hallowed ground, you can then see why she continues to haunt people. Now, remember, one of the taglines in that movie is that she just wants to be heard. Well, that's exactly what the Myling does. It haunts until it is heard. And the message is, bury me properly. And of all things, if you've endured The Ring 2, in Rings, which is the third part of the trilogy, that's exactly what they do. They finally retrieve the body and give it a proper burial. Now, I don't know if they actually researched what they had created with regard to the Myling, but surely they actually are consistent with at least the third part of the trilogy, with the myth of the Myling, and therefore what's going on with the cabin in the woods, the Japanese floaty girl. Now, having said all that, what might this represent in psychiatry? Well, in The Ring, and even though we only see this monster very briefly in the film we're discussing tonight, the background to the Myling is in the film The Ring. And that movie captures a ton of psychology and psychiatry, not the least of which would be aspects of postpartum depression, if not postpartum psychosis in Samara Morgan's mother. Certainly in Samara herself, there's evidence of conduct disorder. There's also evidence of analytic depression. Analytic depression is depression in the infant that manifests as failure to thrive, largely as a result of the misformation of that necessary maternal bond. One example, and one potential cause of that could be postpartum depression and or postpartum psychosis, which Mrs. Morgan does appear to actually endure. She never sleeps, certainly brings up the concern of a sleep-wake disorder as well. So a lot of psychiatry in that Japanese floaty girl, that Myling. And again, another example of how these monsters in this film really do link to, if not a specific disorder, a chapter in the DSM to build a curriculum out of.
Put the name of the ring in Portuguese in the chat, because sometimes the titles in English, they do not correlate at all with the translation. So just in case anybody missed, that's the movie.
And I'll put in the chat too the original movie is Ringu, with subtitles. Did anybody pick up on, again, in a similar context, the monster that was slain in South America? I think it was Argentina. It looked like a Leviathan. It looked like a giant monster, but I didn't necessarily recognize it. And for all I know, Joss Whedon could have just thought about it. He may not have done any research to get an idea of which monster would be well represented in South America. This could have been just his own creation. but I didn't recognize it, so I thought I'd ask. Any other aspects of this film you'd like to discuss?
I thought it was interesting. Like in America, you had sort of the virgin and sexual female disparity there of like who was going to die, that one had to kind of die first and one, it didn't matter if you killed them or not. And that didn't seem to be present in, I guess, really any of the other cultures that they sort of glimpsed to as like a part of their situation. And I was curious, like your thoughts on that for like America versus others, and if you think that is really only sort of a traditional horror theme here.
That's a great question. So let's think this through. So I do think it's a theme here. I do, and I think whether this is Conrad's hero's journey or whether this is Carl Jung and archetypes, there are these universal representations that these characters do fit. So again, they go by different names, tropes versus archetypes, etc. But I think the answer is a definitive yes. They do exist in the United States. Matter of fact, what I will always recommend to medical students is that if you do a quick review, and I know nobody ever does this, but I always say it anyway. If you do a quick review of the minor Jungian archetypes prior to going to a movie, it makes the movie like a lot more interesting, because universally those archetypes are represented and always play out. So not necessarily the major ones. So I'm not really talking about the animus, the anima, the shadow, the self, the persona. I mean all the minor ones, the trickster, the good mother, etc. So they're well represented in films. And again, if you need that proven, do a quick review on your favorite website, and in 2 minutes, take it to a film and you'll see it play out in front of you in the next 90 to 120 minutes. Now, whether the same thing occurs in a film produced outside of the United States, I really don't know. Now, I've watched my share of Asian horror. And my initial impression is not so much. I don't see them nearly as replicated as they are in what appears to be almost like every single horror movie produced in the United States. And again, I'd even go into Asian films that are of the psychological suspense genre as well. I don't see it. Okay. Now, again, if anybody has seen films that you think are examples of these tropes being carried out to the big screen, again, please unmute. Be more than happy to discuss. But off the top of my head, I really can't see this being portrayed outside the United States, at least with regard to Asian horror films.
Yeah, I really can't think of any Brazilian film that would carry the same tropes. I don't know if the other students have any ideas, but from the top of my head, I also can't think. But there was one particular parallel that I could draw from the monsters that were Cabin in the Woods, and an iconic monster from Brazil that I was actually not familiar with. But when I was like researching about it, there's actually an old movie from Brazil. It's actually done there. It's called At Midnight, I'll Take Your Soul. And it is about this guy who is in his quest for immortality for his future son. He wants to basically produce a son that is immortal. And he goes about that by murdering people. And so like I couldn't help but draw the parallel there with a vampire in the Cabin in the Woods, because he is such an iconic, he's an iconic monster of Brazil, per se, you could say. And he's represented in that movie. His name is Zé do Caixão, that's how we call him. It's like Dad Zé. I don't know how to translate it properly to English, but that was interesting, like that parallel that I thought about with the vampire.
So does this particular monster actually eat souls? And and it's to meet the end of either his immortality or that of his son.
Of the sun immortality, yeah. That's what he's been trying to achieve throughout the movie. And he goes about that by murdering a couple, which actually was predicted in the beginning of the movie by a gypsy. She says that he is going to end up doing that, but he doesn't believe her, doesn't believe in the supernatural, even though he is in his quest for immortality. So it's very interesting how at the end of the movie that kind of plays out and it actually happens.
And you know, the search for immortality is one that's universal. I think it's cross-cultural. Comes up in many forms with regard to film and how to achieve that. And I'm thinking Stephen King, but there is a monster, although the origins, I believe, are in Europe, called the Sin Eater. So it's a sinful soul in particular. And it has a little bit of a different outcome with regard to immortality. The Sin Eater is able to absolve the sins of the deceased that would then allow their soul to go to heaven. So, and that particular character is actually demonstrated in Stephen King's The Green Mile, right? The Sin Eater. So kind of similar with regard to the Soul Eater, but certainly a different outcome. The Soul Eater, and more specifically, the search for immortality, has I think, a robust parallel in psychiatry, in that it really has to do with existentialism, existential theory, in terms of trying to make sense of it all, right? So, you know, existentialism and existential theory focuses on an individual's understanding that everything we do meets with a finite end. And how do we make sense of this little time we have to accomplish whatever it is that we're going to? And for people that have difficulty figuring that out, they can absolutely be at risk for developing a mental disorder, including, of course, major depressive disorder. But existential theory focuses on this, and certainly, I think, is part of what these films kind of capture with these different monsters' quests for immortality. Because that, again, that search for immortality is absolutely universal in horror films, and in other genres too. Existentialism, existential theory. So we're kind of right up to the hour. What else can we talk about tonight?
I remember of an urban legend from Brazil, Mula Sem Cabeça, that brings an association with the woman doomed by sin, which transforms into a monster, and how women suffer more than men into these situations.
So the woman transforms into a monster, and what's the pro-social warning? Like, what's the moral of the urban legend?
Gabriela, me ajuda aí.
Ele está perguntando qual que é a moral, por que que ela transforma na mula sem cabeça?
It's usually when women have relationships with priests, and the woman suffer and the priest doesn't. That's the criticism.
Yeah, and just to kind of clarify, Dr. Toby, the monster, it's basically a horse that doesn't have the head, so the head is cut off. But so the monster is basically a headless horse.
And the headless horse causes, again, let's keep medical terminology, morbidity and mortality for the woman.
And for others who come into contact with it.
Yeah, the woman becomes the monster and haunts people around. and it spits fire too.
That's a really iconic one that they use for kids in Brazil to like scare us, for sure. That was a good one.
And that's the general goal of all of our urban legends, is to promote these pro-social warnings, tell the kids, make it real, that this happened to a friend of a friend, so that a particular culture's morals will be continued and not violated. That's universal with regard to all urban legends. In this particular case, it's probably less of a message to not sleep with priests than it is that you better respect our clergy. So, along those contexts, and of course, this would depend, and we'll get to a little bit of Freudian psychology again here, but depending on when this particular story is told to a child, it may go a long way with regard to developing the superego, right? Remember, the superego is that part of our subconscious that is the externalized societal norm. And initially, it's filtered through our parents, our primary caregivers. And as per Freud, one of the milestones that allows the parents to do this is toilet training, right? That is, there's a societal norm on how a child should go to the bathroom. And maybe around 2 years of age, the parents impose this societal norm, and that begins the evolution of the superego. Well, at some point, the parents have to hand the ball off and enlist others to do the same. So we often refer to these individuals as parental expanders, right? So who else is going to be enlisted with regard to making sure the child continues to obey these cultural norms, that is, continues to develop their superego? And the answer is, at least in the US, it's teachers and others, including clergy. So before making that handoff, if you tell a child a story, then they'll have the mindset that when you do allow the clergy to now be part of the larger teaching element to develop that superego, the child's going to say, oh, yes, I'm going to take what they say and I'm going to internalize that, therefore strengthening the superego. At some point, the parents that made up this particular culture deemed that it was necessary to make sure the child understood how important the clergy was and how important the role they played was, so that when they would be enlisted as parental expanders, the child wouldn't ignore, in this case, the priest. So depending on when this particular urban legend is told to children, it may be part of the process of developing that superego. It's kind of interesting too, as you think about it, because in a particular home, when a parent is the first to begin to tell a child what is right and what is wrong, what you now can and can't do, they find no need, perhaps, to tell of an urban legend. What I say goes. But when it's the same message that is going to be by people partnering with the parent, because now there's one degree between the parent and other, the child needs to make sure that, or the parent needs to make sure the child is going to stay focused. So that's the role of the urban legend. This may not come directly from mom, but it's important that you listen to the clergy. Hence, the story of this urban legend. Any other urban legends in Brazil? I have no background whatsoever or I've heard of any myself, but again, I find the universality of urban legends very interesting. How about the film itself? Anything further you'd like to discuss in The Cabin in the Woods?
I think about the urban legends in Brazil. There is this really nice series in Netflix. I don't know the name in English. In Portuguese, is Cidade Invisível. So I think it's kind of like Invisible Town or something like that. And it tells a story of lots of different urban legends from Brazil. The focus is more about protecting the Amazon forest or something like that. But it actually talks a lot about many different urban legends and their kind of like jobs, and centering Brazil from before and today. And it's a really nice series. It's from this year or last year, I'm not so sure, but it's on Netflix and it's really good. Like there were some urban legends that me myself I didn't really know, and I got to know better because of this series. So it's really nice, and I recommend you watch it.
I'll definitely look it up. I wasn't familiar with it, but I will absolutely look it up. How many seasons do we know?
There's only one season. I think the second one was confirmed, but there's no like new news about it.
And whether it's an episode or whether it's the legend itself, any one your favorite?
I'm not so sure. It's not really like one episode talks about one legend in a specific. It's more like a bigger story that all of them are trying to protect something, and each character is developed individually, as long as the episodes go. I think my favorite one is oh my god, what's the name? It's the snake. Gabriela, if you can help me, is the fire one that protects the forest. Like it's the last one that is introduced in the series.
Curupira.
Yes, Curupira.
Oh yeah, yeah, the snake. Yeah, you said it right. It's kind of like a snake. In Brazil, we call it curupira, but it is kind of like a snake, right?
Yeah, it's like a huge giant snake that protects the forest.
The forest, yeah.
From people that want to like knock out trees and build minefields and stuff like that.
I'll definitely check it out.
No, it isn't. It isn't a snake. It is a dwarf, and he has his feet. I don't know how to say that.
Oh, turned like not even I know, like his feet is inverted quite literally. So his legs are straight,
Yeah.
but the feet goes backwards.
Yes,
Right, but
and
he doesn't he transform into a snake? Oh, I thought he did.
Oh, I don't remember that.
I might be thinking about
Yeah, I
something
don't
else.
remember that.
Snake is boitatá.
Oh, right, that's another one. That's another one.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it kind of mix it up, but yeah.
Yeah. But you're right, like the whole goal is to protect the Amazon forest, right?
Yeah.
I will definitely check it out. One of the things that I have a lot of interest in, beyond the monsters, and especially those actually in the cabin in the woods, are dwarfs and similar characters that would be part of the Fae mythology. So there's dozens of them, the large majority of which I had never heard of. But when you read, you realize that they certainly inform a lot of stories and books and films, even though their proper name isn't used in the work itself. So Fae mythology, I think, is incredibly universal. And in most cases, informs books and films alike, despite the fact that they don't actually use the proper name of the Fae or fairy. Right? So now, with regard to dwarfs and gnomes, leprechauns, pretty straightforward, but the vast majority have different names and different characteristics, powers that many people don't know of. The other thing I want to mention too, that you reminded me of with regard to the urban legend around the Amazon, the Amazon, is the actual film Urban Legend. I think is one of the more underrated films that was made. Rotten Tomatoes, I think it really got trashed. Much lower ratings than I thought. With the number of urban legends they contain in the film, and no spoilers, I'm not going to give anything away. I thought the film did a tremendous job of still having a real narrative. I never felt at any point that the film just tried to be all inclusive with regard to making sure they got as many urban legends within the hour and 20 minutes as possible. I thought there was a nice linear progression to it. And for someone who is an urban legend junkie, not the film, but just in general, to watch that film and to really get a good understanding of what's going on before the urban legend itself was fully manifest, I thought was a lot of fun. So very underrated film. And if you enjoy urban myths and have not yet watched that film, I would recommend it. What else is on the table for tonight? I know we're past 8 o'clock. If people need to leave, please feel free. I'd be happy to stick on board, continue any conversation, answer any questions. Certainly, we have the Zoom event until 9 o'clock. I have no problem staying until then if you feel that there's certainly more to talk about. If you have to leave at 8 o'clock, I certainly respect that as well. But for those who are staying on, any particular part of this movie you'd like to discuss further, especially through a psychiatrist lens?
I found interesting too about the value we give to the youth and how we despise the elderly, and we think of them of not of mental illness almost. We give so much value for the youth, and the child or the elderly, they are not well seen in matters of mind.
I agree, absolutely agree. And what the irony is with regard to capturing that in this particular film is that, if I'm thinking this through, all of those monsters are ancient. I mean, so, here's a film that if you look at, and you could identify ageism, but the fact is that the stars of this movie, the actual monsters themselves, are in fact very old, right? I mean, the vampire, the werewolf, the mummy, a lot of them, all of them, are much older than the actual participants, the 4 protagonists are themselves. So I completely agree. The way things are portrayed in this movie are consistent with that universal, I think, observation that medicine in general, psychiatry in particular, has sometimes a difficult time addressing issues pertaining to the elderly. And that's reflected in this film. But at another level, the true stars to this movie, those monsters make this film, are very much older than the protagonists. So it's a little bit of a twist for, I guess, especially those who appreciate and understand, have watched these films that had contained those monsters. They're very old.
I was curious your thoughts, and I thought it was interesting because, we think of sort of substance use, and then the quote stoner was the one who was able to sort of survive, and not just survive in despite his use, but they say because of his use, it somehow made him immune. So I was just curious how you would interpret that, given, substance use. And in his case, the implied abuse of.
Yeah, no, yeah, that was a point in this movie that certainly did not escape me. No doubt. Again, and the point, your point well taken. He survived because of his use of cannabis. All right, so his use somehow through a mechanism that was unexplained allowed him to basically be immune to the chemical that the actual director and her minions were using on the other participants.
I was wondering if you thought it might could maybe symbolize sort of the changing views on some different drugs that we think of as more like party drugs, like using like ketamine for depression or like MDMA for like PTSD. And if maybe it could signify, psych's reviewing of the topic and changing thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly accurate. And the timeline I would build is, you have a culture that begins to change that concept, and then the medical field follows that. So this movie in 2011 is part of a changing culture's views on, in this case, it was cannabis. And then maybe the medical field piggybacks that, albeit up to a decade later. My only thought, if Joss Whedon had consulted us as a consult group, is that while I don't necessarily disagree with that, his choice of substance maybe could have been different, and he probably could have looked at the hallucinogens because they happen to be the class of drug that we knew was efficacious as early as the 60s, and we knew was ready to go through those phase 2 trials again, and we're going to prove the same efficacy. We knew that. And if he had known that, it would have been very interesting with regard to his choice of that class of medication over the one that he actually did decide to choose, which was cannabis. Now, there are ongoing studies with cannabis, but the preliminary outcomes are not yet promising. LSD, psilocybin, DMT, very, very promising. And in the case of ketamine, already in use. Right? So I do agree with you. I think if he had to rewrite this and consulted us, I think we would have maybe turned his attention to a different class of drug, and that's the hallucinogens. Remember, again, just to kind of expand this just a little bit, there's an HBO special on Cary Grant, again, 50s, 60s, that attests to the efficacy of LSD for treatment-resistant depression. And in those cases, and certainly in multiple cases, especially in the 1960s, this medication was microdosed, especially during times of psychotherapy, to allow a sense of connectedness between therapist and patient. Now, unfortunately, a counterculture hijacked the medication, and things happened that resulted in Congress making this drug illegal 1968, 1969. So when these drugs were resurrected, hallucinogens, with regard to undergoing real placebo-controlled trials, we had a real good hunch of these outcomes. And we just had a grand round on this about, well, it was just before the summer. But what we now understand is that in addition to microdosing, there seems to be a real clinical benefit of macrodosing, having an out-of-body experience as a result of LSD and psilocybin and similar acting drugs that does resolve depression and now is even being used for substance use disorders. I would have loved to have that character, the stoner, tripping out on LSD or psilocybin or DMT, ayahuasca, would have made this movie really, I think, medically evidence-based and accurate.
I mean, some of those things are things people traditionally would go to the woods to do. So it would even make sense for him to have it there.
Great
Missed
point.
opportunity.
Yeah, it's a great point. You're right. That's a great point. And boy, having that different state of consciousness, some of the things that they were doing with the mirrors and all the above. Now, the actual spray that they were using, which I still don't quite get, not sure, but certainly all the other stuff they were doing. And with someone with a different state of consciousness, altered state of consciousness, they would absolutely be immune to that. But how they left it, well, something in the cannabis made him immune to our spray. Again, not much, that wasn't peer reviewed.
The only thing I could think was he did display kind of a paranoia when she was going to read the inscription that led to, the choice of their villain. And he was the only one in the room saying, don't read it, don't read it. So maybe the paranoia was there displayed to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was definitely there. Anyway, any other thoughts? Any other characters you want to talk about? Gabrielle, any other final thoughts?
Well, I think one of the other characters that I was thinking about, and Shelby's point to the stoner was like fantastic. I definitely didn't think about that, but that was actually genius. But also the merman, the irony of the merman at the end, it was that guy that bat on him, and he died with the merman. But I couldn't quite make a connection between what the merman would be representing as a metaphor in psychiatry. I was wondering like what your thoughts are on it, because that's certainly a very gruesome character, monster in the movie.
Yes, a couple of thoughts on the merman. Number one, and this kind of piggybacks your initial observation with regard to the universal concern experience of immortality, right? So remember, the merman is a creature that has evolved from the sea, and as such represents the missing link between humans and their ancestors. And a discovery of the merman allows for us to understand why we are here. So it's in search of that ultimate question. It's the missing link, and it's the evolutionary answer to what plagues us as humans, which is, how did we get here? And again, that fits very well into the next question is, or next question being, and where are we going? That gets to the existential component of that. So that's represented by the merman. All right, that's the actual idea here, is that the merman is part of what is referred to as the aquatic ape hypothesis. That is, not only did we evolve, humans evolved from apes, but we evolved from apes that at one time lived in the water. And if we could discover the merman, then we will have validated the aquatic ape theory. So that's one of the representations of the merman. One of the movies that captures this is also set in South America, also set in the Amazon. Anyone know what black and white film I'm referring to? Black and white film, I want to say maybe the 50s, set in the Amazon.
Creature from the Black Lagoon?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, The Creature from the Black Lagoon is about these these doctors and scientists who are on this tramp steamer looking for that merman. They're down there because of a fossil they found that they believe is the missing link to answer that question about our evolution on this planet. right? So there's significant psychology with regard to the creature from the Black Lagoon. Again, that is set in South America. Now, when you watch the creature from the Black Lagoon, and I don't know how many people have watched it or even watched it recently, I have to also admit, I have not seen this movie in several years. But one of the things that really caught my eye was that, there was a reference, I believe, Shelby, to Jekyll and Hyde pertaining to the werewolf. Well, that exists here as well. There is, and I don't know the character's name, but one of the main characters, one of the protagonists on that tramp steamer and the creature are never seen in the entire movie together. Never. Now, I don't think that this guy dives into the Black Lagoon, has some kind of a costume down there, changes into it, comes up, and taunts and terrorizes his scientific colleagues. I don't think that's what's going on. But I think at a metaphorical level, you're looking at a person who is struggling with his animal self. And to the extent that we never see him in the same scene with the creature, I think is strongly suggestive of that. This particular character is at odds with one of his colleagues who are both smitten with the woman on that boat. And I'm not going to tell you how this plays out, but this love triangle certainly gets, let's say, mediated by the creature. I'll just leave it there. So from a Freudian perspective, the creature in the Black Lagoon looks as if, in the setting of a love triangle, is really focused on the internal struggle that one of these characters is having between how he wants to present himself, his persona, and that more animalistic base side of himself, which is his shadow, right? And remember, this shadow archetype that we're talking about, this is Jungian psychology, is that archetype that we basically inherit through our ancestors' experiences, right? And boy, doesn't the creature in the Black Lagoon, doesn't the missing link fit perfect with regard to that part of the Jungian theory? Actually inheriting past ancestral experiences, missing link, creature. So the creature in the Black Lagoon, and therefore the merman, is a wonderful monster to look at with regard to Jungian psychology as well, and this battle between our persona, how we want to actually portray ourselves, that facade we use and show to the world, versus that inner subconscious shadow archetype, the creature itself. The final thing I'll say about the creature in the Black Lagoon, I have a lot to say about the merman, is that there is a female counterpart called the mermaid. Now, the mermaid is much more glorified. Mermen never strike me as anything being sensual or charismatic, and certainly was not portrayed as such in The Cabin in the Woods. Mermaids are a little different, with the exception of some movies. Mermaids are usually alluring. I think the easiest example here would be that portrayed by Walt Disney. Now, The Little Mermaid is based on a story that is anything but Disney-esque. It is a dark, dark story. But the Disney version of it is certainly much lighter. So folklore gets turned into fairy tale, as only Disney can. But I think part of this conversation would be to address what the merman's tale told by Walt Disney, known as The Little Mermaid, is really about. So I'll briefly pause here with that introduction. Anybody see this movie? And anybody have an opinion about what this movie called The Little Mermaid is about?
I mean, just about the movie itself would be like the classic cautionary tale, like what we were saying all kind of urban legends are, cautionary tales, especially for children. And I think specifically, obviously the male female dynamic of sort of don't throw it all away for a girl, to throw it all away for a man, don't do that, that kind of thing.
You said it much better than I could have said it. I was actually going to say your father is always right, but I think the way you said it is much more appropriate. Others? Other opinions? So what do we know happens to Ariel?
Her voice is taken.
Her voice is taken. Good. And what was the benefit of her voice being taken?
That she was given legs and she could walk on land and participate.
Can somebody describe to me the first time she walks and what you observed?
I think she was struggling, if I remember correctly. She was really struggling to get used to walking on two legs.
Yeah, matter of fact, in the book, in the story, it actually is described as her feeling as if she's walking on knives, and feeling that there are needles in her legs. Now, what would be the clinical or neurological term for that?
Like paresthesias.
Paresthesias, right? Neuropathy. Yep.
Mhm.
So, the other take on this movie, of course, is that if you view the Little Mermaid through a psychiatrist lens, if Ariel were to present to you with a chief complaint of blank being, of course, the narrative of the film, one of the things that I think a clinician would provisionally consider is that this individual, this young girl, was suffering from psychosis. I mean, the belief that you lived under the sea and only walked or started walking a day ago, etc. What probably would be psychosis, or at least provisionally, to be fair. So when you take these three observations of psychosis, loss or hoarseness of voice, and paresthesias, anything come to mind with regard to toxin exposure? That's a triad for poisoning. From what? Mercury. Okay. Now, how do humans get exposed to elemental mercury? Fish, exactly right. Right. So it's noteworthy that this film is about a mermaid and about a fish, right? Because it really is about, and it allows us to teach mercury poisoning, and really more specifically what we would refer to as a drug or a toxin-induced psychotic disorder, with that toxin being mercury. So that's another kind of extension to the Merman method. So Merman has a lot to teach, not only through The Cabin in the Woods, but related stories, Creature from the Black Lagoon and The Little Mermaid. We're at the bottom of the hour. Any other questions? Any other aspects of this film? Any other monsters you'd like to discuss in the remaining minutes we have left?
I would like to just ask you a question. After everything you said about the merman, can't we kind of associate him with the werewolf? Because it's kind of like returning to your origin, like animal origin or something like that. And that got me thinking, can't we just kind of use the same thoughts about the werewolf and the merman? Isn't it kind of related?
They're definitely related. Yeah, they're definitely related. And again, I think the link if we wanted to keep this consistent with the literature, is that of either Freudian or Jungian psychology. In Freud, we call it the id, so the wolf half of the Wolfman myth, and the mer half of the Merman connote this animal side, this id side, where one's impulses and instincts are housed. And the Jungian equivalent would be the shadow. Yep, they're definitely related.
I was curious about your thoughts in the very opening scene. And Bradley Whitford's character is discussing the fertility of his wife. And I feel like that's just such a common theme for so many things, especially in horror sort of fertility issues. And I was wondering if you thought at any point that came into play, because I didn't really notice anything. And it felt like sort of the smoking gun that was never kind of discussed again.
Yeah, when I hear this in a horror movie, I'm often worried that particular subplot is going to be made critical through some form of demonic possession. That is, the woman then will be a vessel for another character, a demon, for example, with regard to what role fertility plays, how to unleash evil on the earth. Of course, that's incredibly metaphorical with regard to misogyny and the devil / men spewing evil. So again, sociologically, I think there's a parallel there. I think with regard to your observation, though, that this was a topic that was presented and then kind of lost, may have had something to do with what actual item in that basement was chosen. If not, the torture zombie, and if instead the demon, yeah, I think there would have been this would have been much different, much different. I think it had just come down to choice, perhaps a random choice. If a demon, that particular character was in a lot of trouble, because I think that's one way, and we've seen this before, Rosemary's Baby, where the woman is nothing but a vessel for the demon to possess, and therefore allow their progeny to populate evil on earth. That was my take. I'll also say this: we had this idea, and maybe you can carry this to Scream. We had this idea of a reimagined timeline where there were other items in that basement chosen, and how the movie would be different, and what a perfect Netflix series that would be. So for each item, there'd be an hour Netflix show that would focus on the alternative ending because of that alternative monster in the cabin in the woods. So I think last year we brought this up with Scream. We never got to do anything with it, but that's certainly something we could consider. Somebody at UBHC just sent me some contact information. You can actually solicit advice from lawyers that work with Netflix with regard to how to vet ideas, because they will not allow you to contact Netflix directly, but through this Netflix related service, we do have a contact to actually pass these ideas along to, maybe even a couple of examples. So maybe at our next Scream meeting, we could actually talk about that. Because I particularly would not have picked up that diary. I mean, I would have went in a completely different direction. But again, that's me, and that's because I've been doing this with horror for several decades. I would have definitely not picked up that diary.
I had a question too with regards to the diary, because I noticed that once one of the main characters read the literature in Latin, that's when everything started taking place. I want to know, is there always a reason why, like for instance, particularly in this movie, when she read the Latin, like an old, no longer like common used language, the old, no longer present like beings like zombies started to rise. Is there like a link to that? And is there also a reason why they would use a foreign, basically no longer used language to signify some type of basically signify something significantly, not necessarily like exciting, but something like unusual being about to happen?
Two answers come to mind. One is, I think, primarily focused on what the director may have been thinking, and the other one is really medically focused and therefore personalized. I think from a director's perspective, Latin has always been a go-to. And again, this is a movie, remember, that is taking on stereotypes and archetypes. This movie, similar to Scream, is a movie within a movie, right? It discusses and it exposes the rules to horror. And again, that's very consistent with Wes Craven's Scream. So along those lines, what do we know about the language that would be chosen, particular for that diary in general, and maybe other aspects of this and other films in particular? Well, the answer is that Latin sells. We've seen this maybe as early as The Exorcist, 1973, that when we hear something in Latin, I think as audience, we know something's about to happen. If it were in English, well, again, this is a horror movie, so it was going to happen anyway. But Latin is the go-to. Latin is that symbolic, archetypal language that hallmarks horror, because every horror movie uses it, right? And this is a movie about every horror movie. So it was an obvious choice from that perspective. From a little bit of a different perspective, and again, I'll own this because it's only my idea, but movies like this, I think, are a welcomed venue to discuss medicine in general, and for me, psychiatry in particular. I've made no excuses about that, right? Again, that elevator contains monsters for which I have built PowerPoints for every single one to cover the entire DSM with the exception of the child adolescent illnesses. So that said, Latin is a dead language, but what was the last field to use it? The answer is medicine, right? So an easy segue to what my belief is should be the real use of this particular movie, and that is to teach aspects of medicine, to teach aspects of mental health. And it's exactly what we do. So I like the segue there too, even though I understand that Joss Whedon certainly would think that this is totally coming out of the blue. I could certainly lend that twist to the use of Latin in The Cabin in the Woods. Before we end, does anybody want to random pick just one more monster from this movie? And we'll go out with a final discussion of any monster of your choice. Anyone?
I was thinking of the ghosts as like complex bereavement.
Yep. So, and from my perspective, I'll try to fill in why. Again, when you're building a course curriculum and you're building a course syllabus, in this particular case, we've tried to actually look at 3 distinct blocks of mental disorders. And our first block mainly focuses on ghosts and spirits. Spirits and demons, I believe, are interchangeable. So looking at our first block, we were trying to think of what illnesses should be those illnesses taught by ghost stories versus those illnesses that are taught through stories of spirit or demonic possession. So what was really helpful was pairing this particular movie, The Cabin in the Woods, in that elevator, with the movie Paranormal Activity 2. Because in Paranormal Activity 2, there is a character named Allie Ray, who discusses the difference between a ghost and a demon. A ghost's haunt is largely episodic, while a demon's presence is chronic and persistent. And that wording could have not been any better, because there are illnesses in the DSM that are defined through discrete episodes of behavior that are a change from a previous baseline. So depressive disorders, bipolar and related disorders, delirium, easy examples. Similarly, or conversely, there are disorders that are also regarded as chronic and persistent. So what we were able to do is take those chronic and persistent illnesses and find movies about demonic possession that best represented them. And similarly, we looked at different stories that contain ghosts and made sure that they were in a place that they can teach illnesses that are defined through discrete episodes. And that's exactly what we did. So for our purposes, the ghost stories that teach these episodic illnesses include Coraline. There are 3 ghosts in Coraline with regard to the lost children. Coraline is a movie about an episodic illness, a ghost/episodic illness that is called delirium. Similarly, Shakespeare's Macbeth is a story about a ghost, specifically Banquo's ghost itself, about the episodic illness called delirium. So in either case, we have 2 ghost stories that teach of that particular episodic illness, delirium. Next, we have the ghost story, The Sixth Sense. We have the ghost story, The Babadook. And in each case, it deals with depressive disorders. And then finally, we have a ghost story called Field of Dreams, which, because it's a ghost, will be an episodic haunt. Field of Dreams is about the episodic illness called the bipolar and related disorder. So we covered delirium, the depressive disorders, and bipolar and related disorders through multiple films that include ghosts, their haunt being episodic, allowing for this, the discussion of these episodic conditions that are contained in the particular chapters of the DSM. So with regard to the ghost populating that elevator in the cabin in the woods, there is a significant presence of the ghost in our curriculum to teach delirium, the depressive disorders, as well as the bipolar and related disorders.
And I put the titles of the movies in Portuguese too, because sometimes the translation is completely not accurate. They give completely different titles of the movie. So that's something that I've always struggled, like, what is that movie? So I put the titles there in the chat for you guys.
Thank you. We're about 1:45. Any final thoughts? Any final words of wisdom? Anyone? Well, I think certainly I would certainly want to say a big thank you to Gabriella for putting this together. This was great. So sincere thanks for allowing us to be part of this event tonight. I think it was great. And if, again, anybody has any feedback, certainly any questions that come up after the fact, reach out to Gabriella. Certainly she'll get any information to me. If you follow me on Twitter, I'll post with regard to different things that we do broadcast live. So you'll get a notification that we are live. And if there's something that you are interested in that you just don't have the time or availability to participate in live, we do record these sessions and post them on my website as well as my YouTube channel as well. So more than invited. And again, hopefully we'll see you on social media soon.
I'd also like to thank you. Welcome, Dr. Toby, and I'd like to thank everybody for the participation tonight. All of you guys who are here and who participated, and certainly even if you didn't, that's totally fine. Dr. Toby does a lot of these movie analysis, like he said, on his social media. So definitely follow him on Instagram, Twitter. He's always going live, and they're always very, very interesting to kind of study psychiatry via movies and series. And I think that's just fantastic and an amazing way to learn. But again, thank you guys so much. And I will be sending you guys your certificates too, with your names soon within the next 2 business days, I would say. But definitely my email was also on the chat. Feel free to reach out with any questions, any follow-up, like Dr. Toby said, feedback. We're open to it. Any other questions you may have, I'm more than happy to help out.
I would like to thank Gabrielle and Dr. Tobia for the invitation. It was a unique opportunity that brought a lot of learning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you,
Have
guys.
a good night.
Have a good night. All right, Dr. Toby, I will send you the recording as well.